One of the most notable aspects of the medieval period is the phenomenon of the Crusades. There are 5 or 6 of these total, depending on how you count. I want to talk here about the First Crusade, what gave rise to a crusading ideology, and the effects of the Crusades both on Christians and Jews alike. A significant background for this is that there was significant internal violence within Christian Europe, especially in the Frankish territories in the 11th century. The First Crusade is called by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont, which I've referenced in an earlier video. A key theme for this council was to enact reform of both church and society. So there's this emphasis on clerical celibacy as a means of purifying the church, and eliminating the practice of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, as a further act of reform. The First Crusade then is called as part of Pope Urban II's understanding of himself as a source of unity, representative of the unity of both the sacred and secular aspects of Christianity, with the Pope at the top of Christian society. So he calls this crusade for several different reasons. I want to lay out 4 of them for you. One is this notion of the importance of freeing Jerusalem from Muslim rulers. During this time, the Egyptian Fatimid dynasty controlled Jerusalem, and the politics of this dynasty led to hindering of Christian pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem, and extracting of hefty fees in order for people to make their progress on pilgrimage. So there's a sense that it's unjust that non-Christians have taken over the holy city of Jerusalem, and it ought to be returned to Christian hands. So there's a geopolitical dimension to us and a spiritual dimension to this, as it's also about preserving and protecting pilgrims, people engaged in acts of spiritual devotion. There's also a further goal here of uniting the Latin and Greek churches. In part, it looks like Urban is responding to Greek, Byzantine, East Roman pleas to help them liberate Christian lands that have been captured by the Fatimids and other Islamic political entities. And so this is a making common cause with their fellow Christians in an armed excursion. But also, it appears that this crusade is called as a means of providing an outlet for these social tensions, especially among these Frankish nobility. That is, warfare shouldn't happen internally within Christianity, but rather it should be pushed outward. That is, warfare among brethren is sinful, and so, but it's better then to help use the force of arms in defense of other areas of Christianity, of Christendom. So this is called then a crusade for the means of mobilizing what was actually a fairly powerful Frankish military force. And then finally, there's a theological assumption lying behind Pope Urban II's calling of the crusade, which is that Islam represents the force of Antichrist, that it is this rival religious power that in some ways has distorted aspects of the scriptural heritage and is oppressing Christians in Jerusalem and in other areas, and it must be defeated. And so this is also a convenient way to then mobilize the French nobility to defeat the forces of Antichrist. What better thing for the Pope to send people on crusade for? And so now we're seeing a whole lot of spiritual dimensions then of the crusade. Again, if we're thinking about a unified secular and spiritual sphere, we can't separate the political and the spiritual. So some of the themes here are fourfold. One, that this crusade would be a liberation of Jerusalem and the holy places as a spiritual endeavor. Second, that this is a kind of pilgrimage. It's an armed pilgrimage, really. And we just see it in the very name. A crusader simply meant one who was marked with a cross. The Latin word for cross is crux. And so the crusaders had crosses placed on their clothing, much as pilgrims did. Third, then, is a notion of, if this is an armed pilgrimage, then death on crusade is equivalent to martyrdom. Now, we don't have any actual soldier martyrs who emerge out of crusading ideology, but the legend of St. George and the Dragon is actually carried back to Western Europe from the encounter with the cult of St. George in Greek Christendom. And so George does emerge as a kind of crusading saint as a result. And he becomes eventually the patron saint of England. Similarly, if this is a pilgrimage, then going on crusade is an act of penance, and there is a remission of sins in the form of a papal indulgence for those who go on crusade. We're going to spend more time talking about indulgences in a few sessions. But if you're dealing with a violent, blood-shedding society like the Franks, they have a lot of sin to atone for. And so again, going on crusade is going on a pilgrimage. So we have all of these facets linking together here now all of a sudden. The Crusaders, through many turmoils, as you read in the account of the First Crusade by Guibert Nogent, went through lots of turmoil. Their capture of Jerusalem as the apex of the story reads a lot like the Israelite conquest of the land of Canaan. So, for instance, there's an image of the Israelites circling around the walls of Jerusalem, much as an imitation of the circling around the city of Jericho and the fall of that city. This, in part, has to do with the fact that the Franks understood themselves as a new Israel, and so they believe they're fulfilling the biblical restoration of Jerusalem itself. And in some ways, they believe they're ushering in the end times for some. There's a kind of an apocalyptic dimension to all this. We have to note some of the really distressing aspects of the Crusade narratives. The seizure of Jerusalem involves a slaughter of the so-called pagan residents. This would have involved the murder of Muslim unarmed citizens. It probably also involved the murder of Jews, and indeed even perhaps of indigenous Christians. And so the violence of the text is something we need to spend time with. Indeed, they talk about the looting that happens as also right and proper for the army of God. So taken as a whole, we can read this narrative as stating that the Crusaders are an instrument of God to punish the Islamic Caliphate for the seizure of the holy places of Jerusalem and the harassment of pilgrims. And that the capturing of Jerusalem is a resetting of the right order of things as desired by God. I want us to stop here and digest this material. And then in the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more fully about how this impacts Jewish communities in Europe and the legacy of that for thinking about medieval Jewish-Christian relations.